It's a throwaway, a piece of garbage.
It's a throwaway, a piece of garbage. This is what John Lennon had to say about one of his own songs on Sgt. Pepper, possibly the most critically acclaimed album of all time.
But it was not as put together as it sounds, and
believe it or not, there are songs that John Lennon hates, sessions that bored Ringo to tears, and during the album's recording, George wished he was anywhere else. The album came at a time when George had almost left, and John was almost seriously injured, and monumental pressure fell upon Paul to deliver the goods. In this video, we'll have a look at the other side of Sgt. Pepper, a story that only true friends could have emerged out of on top. Chapter 1. Is This Farewell?
I've never really known what it's been like as the Beatles.
On August the 21st of 1966, the Beatles had found themselves in a cold and windy San Francisco as they performed for one last time at Candlestick Park. After a brief 33-minute set, John, Paul, George, and Ringo waved goodbye. They were not only waving goodbye to this particular audience, they were waving goodbye to the concept of ever touring again.
One reason we don't want to tour anymore is that when we're on stage, nobody can hear us or listen to us.
Their final tour was now complete, and as George sank into his airplane seat, he gleefully said, "That's it, I'm not a Beatle anymore." Once the plane had landed back at Heathrow Airport, all four Beatles would go their separate ways, looking to clear their heads from Beatlemania, with rumors circulating that the Beatles were breaking up.
This rumor we were splitting up was rubbish too. Yeah, one would think it is the first time any of us had done anything on his own. John wrote books on his own all along, and we all have sidelines we get on with as individuals. Besides, we're all great friends, and we don't want to split up. There's never been any talk or sign of it, except in the minds of others.
John Lennon headed to Spain to star in the film How I Won the War. Paul stayed in London to compose the score for the movie The Family Way, and Ringo stayed in England to spend time with his family. And it may not surprise you to learn that George went off to India to learn the sitar.
When John wanted to do a film on his own, we were all happy for him. As Beatles, we've become richer in experience.
This decision to never tour again would be a difficult one, but the Beatles were in a different place now.
We really hated that four little mop-top approach. We were not boys, we were men. It was all gone. All that boy, all that screaming. We didn't want any more.
The Beatles is still something abstract as far as I'm concerned. You know, it's something that other people see us as the Beatles, and I try to see us as the Beatles, but I can't.
Rumors of a breakup began to swirl around, and on top of that, a perhaps even worse rumor began to fester. The Beatles were washed up.
Our whole outlook on life is changing because our circumstances have changed our surroundings. But this hasn't done anything to disunite the Beatles way, and we are going to keep on making better tracks and become better entertainers as the Beatles way.
Before we move on to why, make sure to hit subscribe to join a community of Beatles fans and to be able to watch some of the best Beatles content on YouTube.
Silently. Because we were done touring, people in the media were starting to sense that there was too much of a lull, which created a vacuum. So they could bitch about us now. They'd say, "Oh, they've dried up."
Amidst this turmoil, Paul came up with a light bulb moment. During this hiatus, he went on a safari trip to Kenya, and on the plane back to London, realized what they needed to do.
I think this has been the reason for our continued success. You know, we could have stopped thinking up new things and brought out Son of Please Please Me or The Son of Love Me Dude, but that was not on, you know. We work on one song and record it and then get tired of it. So we think up something very different. Like the strength of any act is doing something that you wouldn't associate with them.
Instead of making the next Beatles album with the weight of the world on their shoulders, how about they pretended that they weren't the Beatles? It was here when Paul came up with the idea of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, a fictional band that did not carry the same baggage as the Beatles. This may have helped Paul, but as we'll soon get into it, recording this would be a difficult period for its other three members. The band would then finally reconvene at Abbey Road Studios with the incredibly daunting task of living up to the world's expectations of the Beatles. Chapter 2: The Discarded Masterpieces.
Let me take you down.
With John Lennon facing this crisis, he returned to his roots and looked back home to Liverpool. While living in his childhood home on Menlove Avenue, he regularly walked by a place called Strawberry Fields, which had led him to write Strawberry Fields Forever. In the song, John sings, "No one I think is in my tree."
Well, what I was trying to say in that line is nobody seems to be as hip as me, therefore I must be crazy or a genius.
Within this song, John revealed the sense of madness and depression that he was going through, something that would become much more apparent throughout the recording of the album. This sensational track spurred Paul to also write a song about Liverpool. Paul looked back when he first began singing as a choir boy, when music was not all about fame and fortune, but simply about creating something beautiful for friends and family. Paul regularly sang at St. Barnabas Church by Penny Lane, and he wrote a nostalgic song about this area of his hometown.
There is a barber showing photographs.
The words are written down, but the music is never, because we can't write music. We play it to each other and soon pick it up and fool around with it a bit. George suggests something extra, then John adds a new idea, and so on, until we have the music the way we want it. Then we record, and then we forget about it and get on with the next track.
Right off the bat, the Beatles had two phenomenal tracks from Lennon and McCartney, both of which would become perfect for their new album. But while the Beatles were enjoying this time in the studio, Brian Epstein was panicking. The Beatles needed to release new music, and they needed to be hits. With pressure growing from the label EMI, they released a double A-side containing Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane.
Penny Lane is
In those days, releasing a single and then putting it on the album later would be seen as cheating the public, so these two songs were sacrificed to keep the Beatles on top. Surprisingly, both of these songs did not reach #1 in the UK. They were kept from the #1 spot by the song Release Me by Engelbert Humperdinck of all people. The rumors that the Beatles were no longer on top began to gain momentum, and Brian Epstein's plan to silence the critics did the opposite. The only track left from these early sessions was When I'm 64, a song written by Paul from the early days of the Beatles.
when I'm 64.
It would be a song that John didn't hate, but didn't necessarily like either. The idea of imagining life in 40 years' time was completely alien to him.
I would never even dream of writing a song like that. There's some things I never think about, and that's one of them.
Paul apparently resurfaced the song because his father was turning 64. However, I have heard a theory. In 1966, the Beach Boys released Pet Sounds, a complex yet commercial set of beautiful songs about love and heartache. When I'm 64 is essentially the Beatles' version of Wouldn't It Be Nice? Paul was engaged in a rivalry with the Beach Boys, particularly Brian Wilson. As the group continued to grow, the Beach Boys were breathing down their necks as the biggest band in the world. Speaking about Pet Sounds,
That was the album that flipped me. The music invention on that album was like, wow.
with Pet Sounds, Wilson had put the ball in Paul's court, but he now needed to come back with something of equal acclaim.
We have always changed our style as we went along, and we've never been frightened to develop and change.
With these recording sessions, the stakes could not have been any higher. But to make matters worse, Paul's songwriting partner John was hitting a new low. In fact, it was during this time that Paul wrote his most hated Beatles song.
They've got all these rules of how to live, how to paint, how to make music, and it's just not true anymore. They don't work, all those rules. Like, you can't apply them because it means then that you're assuming that you know it all.
Chapter 3: When John Hated His Own Songs.
Sgt Pepper is called the first concept album, but it doesn't go anywhere.
With touring out of the way, John had a massive void in his life. Touring all four corners of the globe would be replaced with an ordinary humdrum life in England.
I was in a real big depression in Pepper, and I know that Paul wasn't at the time. He was feeling full of confidence. I was going through murder.
While John was writing songs for Sgt Pepper, he spent many boring hours watching TV.
A couple of weeks of telly watching is as good as pot. I think a lot when I'm watching telly. It's like looking into the fire and daydreaming. You're watching it, but your mind's not on it.
John would be suffering from writer's block. The words were not coming to him, and so he had no choice but to plagiarize a cereal commercial that he'd heard on the television.
If I'm a bit low and not getting much done, then the words on the telly come through. That's when I heard, "Good morning, good morning." It was a cornflakes advertisement.
The cornflakes jingle sang, good morning, the best to you each morning. Sunshine breakfast, Kellogg's cornflakes, crisp and full of fun." John would go on to record this song, Good Morning, as part of their February sessions and refer to it as a throwaway piece of garbage. But for whatever reason, Paul wanted to use it for the album. Paul was emerging as the band's de facto leader, and perhaps the use of a song that John didn't like on the album was a power move. Or perhaps Good Morning isn't that bad of a song, and John should not have been so hard on himself.
Jealousy doesn't exist. When John wanted to do a film on his own, we were all happy for him. Now that he's done it, he has passed on to us information about all sorts of things he has learned. That is, as Beatles, we become richer in experience. And George went to India and told us what he had learned. I wrote film music and found out other things, which I've passed on.
Let us know your thoughts on Good Morning in the comments down below. That all being said, John's fears about Paul go much further than the song. And according to John, Paul was trying to sabotage his favorite songs. When John spoke about the song Across the Universe, which was recorded a few years later,
Across the universe.
he may have also been referring to some songs from Sgt Pepper.
Paul would sort of subconsciously try and destroy a great song usually. We'd spend hours doing little detailed cleaning ups of Paul's songs. When it came to mine, somehow this atmosphere of looseness and casualness and experimentation would creep in, subconscious sabotage.
John may have also been referring to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, as he ended up hating how it turned out.
The track is just terrible. I mean, it is a great track, a great song, but it isn't a great track because it wasn't made right. You know what I mean?
You'd be hard-pressed to find many Beatles fans who think that Lucy in the Sky sounds terrible, but the fact that John claims the song was not made right is incredibly revealing of the tension at the time. Things could have been even worse. Towards the end of March of that year, John was on the verge of becoming seriously injured, and perhaps the ending of his life. Chapter 4. Quick, John's on the Roof. On March the 21st of 1967, John and Paul headed to Abbey Road for an evening session, with the hopes of getting the backing vocals done for a song called Getting Better.
It's getting better all the time.
Knowing that this session could go on all night, Lennon took what he thought was a pill of a sort of caffeine, when in reality, he had just taken LS.
I said, "What is it? I feel ill." I thought I felt ill and I thought I was going cracked. Then it dawned on me that I must have taken some
The Beatles at the time had regularly smoked marijuana, but never did it in front of George Martin, who they thought would disapprove. Instead of declaring what he was on, John decided to tell George Martin that he had fallen ill. Martin's response was,
"Come on, John. What you need is a good breath of fresh air."
To get some fresh air at Abbey Road, you couldn't simply go outside. This was one of the main drawbacks of being one of the Beatles, as there were always a lot of screaming fans wherever they went. George brought John up to the roof, and John looked up to the stars and said, "Aren't they fantastic?" When George Martin came back down, Paul and George Harrison asked where John went. George Martin casually said that he had brought him to the roof, not knowing the danger John was in. Paul and George looked at each other in the eyes and darted out of the studio. On the roof was a narrow parapet with a 30-foot drop. A fall of this height may have resulted in bruises, broken bones, or if he fell in the wrong way, a head injury. Paul and George then sprinted upstairs, and on the rooftop they let out a sigh of relief as they saw John. He may have been somewhere else mentally, but physically he was still safely on the roof. And according to the Beatles, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds has absolutely nothing to do with this kind of thing. But do you believe them? Or do you believe it's another part of their cheeky sense of humor? Let us know in the comments below. It had been an eventful couple of months for John, but as for his pal Ringo, things were a lot less exciting. He had spent so much time waiting around that he learned to play chess.
See, I never really liked Sgt Pepper. I think it's a fine album. All the work we do is fine. But I think I felt like a session man on it. We put so much on it, strings and brass. And you'd sit around the studio for days while they're overdubbing other things. It is a fine album, but just for me. Emotionally, I prefer Abbey Road and a lot of the White Album.
But towards the end of the recording of Sgt Pepper, Ringo would finally have his time to shine. Chapter 5, Ringo's Not Going Home. On March the 29th of that year, Paul traveled out to John's house in Kenwood to develop a song they were working on, a song that Ringo could sing. Paul arrived at 2 p.m. and went up to John's workroom at the top of the house. After a couple of hours, they worked on several lines, but something was missing. It would be their intention to have the song finished that afternoon and then head to Abbey Road to record it. However, they decided to tell Ringo it was finished and get to the studio right away. George Harrison was also needed, as were George Martin and the engineer Geoff Emerick. The evening turned into night, and night nearly to dawn. At Abbey Road, a sign that the session was over was when Ringo grabbed his coat. This would be the green light for George Martin and Geoff Emerick to grab their coats as well, but the other Beatles wanted to keep on going. On his way to leave, Ringo stopped by Paul.
Where are you going, Ring?
Home to bed.
No, let's do the vocal now.
But I'm knackered.
No, come on back here and do some singing for us.
Geoff Emerick is convinced that springing this upon him made him less nervous. He said,
"Perhaps the shock tactic of having him sing when he was least expecting it took the nervousness away. Or perhaps it was just how supportive everyone was being." All three of his compatriots gathered around him, inches behind the microphone, silently conducting and cheering him on as he gamely tackled his vocal duties. It was a touching show of unity among the four Beatles.
After a few takes, Ringo's vocals were then laid down, but with one minor problem.
It took a lot of coaxing from Paul to get me to sing that last note.
So, quite fittingly, Ringo got by with a little help from his friends. But Ringo's boredom would be shared by George. The others realized that his early threat to leave the Beatles was merely set out of frustration, and he meant no longer a Beatle in terms of playing live. However, there were things happening during this time that really infuriated him, and during these sessions, he decided to get revenge. Chapter 6, George's Revenge. George's songwriting talents had particularly flourished in the Revolver album, but during Sgt Pepper, his songs were not cutting the mustard.
I just got back from India and my heart was still out there. After what happened in 1966, everything else seemed like hard work. It was a job, like doing something I didn't really want to do, and I was losing interest in being fab at that point.
George's first song offering came in the form of sarcasm. In the same way that John and Paul had written about Liverpool, George was also asked to write a love song for the north of England. He wrote only a northern song. However, in true George fashion, there was a hidden joke behind it all. At the time, the royalties for the Beatles recordings were split with 30% for Lennon and McCartney and only 1.6% for George and Ringo. This would be arranged by the publishing company Northern Songs. George was merely a contracted writer and made a minuscule amount for royalties from a song that he had written. And so, George got revenge by singing, "It doesn't really matter what chords I play, what words I say, or time of day it is, as it's only a northern song." Upon hearing the song, George Martin groaned inside. Geoff Emerick described it as a weak track that we all winced at, and John did not even bother to help with the backing track. The song didn't go well with the others, as did his song Within You, Without You. Harrison's pitch for the song on his acoustic guitar would not be met with approval. However, George Martin saw something in it, and according to Martin,
It was a bit of a relief all around. The tune struck me as being a little bit of a dirge, but I found what George wanted to do with the song fascinating.
George Harrison realized that he was missing India and that he could bring India to this recording. Harrison called up members of London's Asian Music Circle and brought Indian musicians into Abbey Road one evening. It was one of the rare moments where George was fully in control of what was taking place, where he wasn't playing second fiddle, and he relished it. George would only have one song on the album, but an incredibly memorable one. And with contributions from John, Paul, George, and Ringo, it was finally a Beatles album. The world waited with bated breath to see what they had come up with. Chapter 7: A Summer Like No Other. Sgt Pepper would be released on the 26th of May in the UK and the 2nd of June in 1967. Although the Beatles had quit playing live, the album's release is synonymous with one iconic live performance. On Sunday, the 4th of June 1967, Paul and George were in attendance at the Seville Theatre in London. They had gone to see the Jimi Hendrix Experience and noticed their opening number had a distinctly familiar chord progression.
Jimmy opened, the curtains flew back, and he came walking forward, playing Sgt Pepper, and it had only been released on the Thursday, so that was like the ultimate compliment.
When the Beatles left San Francisco in 1966, little did they know that they were leaving the exact epicenter of what would become the Summer of Love. The Beatles had created an album that went on tour and was played across all four corners of the globe.
It was the Summer of Love. US Air Force B-52s were dropping 800 tons of bombs a day on North Vietnam. Mao Zedong's Red Guards had the whole of China by the throat. But from where I was sitting, at EMI's Abbey Road studios in West London, people in their thousands were giving themselves over to peace and love.
However, this sentiment has not been shared by John. In fact, he believes that Sgt Pepper and the Summer of Love were all one great big myth. Chapter 8: The Myth of Sgt Pepper.
I always preferred it to all the other albums, including Pepper, because I thought the music was better. No, the Pepper myth is bigger, but the music on the White Album is far superior, I think.
John's favorite Beatles album was always the White Album. While you could argue that this came from bitterness towards Paul, John does have a point. Sgt Pepper was certainly in the right place at the right time. During that glorious Summer of Love, people were probably still listening to Pet Sounds, but they were also listening to Jimi Hendrix's Are You Experienced?, the self-titled album from The Doors, and the Velvet Underground and Nico, just to name a few. Everyone was simply spoiled for choice in that glorious year. But what other albums have we missed from the Summer of Love? Let us know in the comments down below. Sgt Pepper was also misinterpreted as a concept album, and it was made out to be a bit more than it was. According to John,
Sgt Pepper is called the first concept album, but it doesn't go anywhere. All my contributions to the album have nothing to do with this idea of Sgt Pepper and his band, but it works because we said it worked. But it was not as put together as it sounds, except for Sgt Pepper introducing Billy Shears and the so-called reprise. Every other song could have been on any other album.
Ultimately, the myth is because Sgt Pepper became the soundtrack to that summer. And like all good summers, it finally came to an end. The evenings became shorter, the leaves began to fall, and reality started to seep back in. But Sgt Pepper remains a keepsake for when the world felt that extra bit magical. Tell us your story of when you first heard about it in the comments down below. However, the story doesn't end there. Cracks were beginning to show within the close-knit Beatles, and in the next video is all about how Hey Jude had secret and heartfelt messages from Paul, and we did research to show it wasn't about Julian. It is an amazing story, and it's a wild ride.
Phasing is great.
Double flanging.
Double flanging, we call it. Now there you go, right? We're on the same thing. Flanging is great. We're always doing it.
You used it on Lucy in the Sky.
Yeah. You name the one it isn't on, you know, you name it. You spot it, you get a prize, you get a Sgt Pepper badge.
You know, I've never really known what it's been like as the Beatles, because you see, the Beatles was still something abstract as far as I'm concerned. You know, it's something that other people see us as the Beatles. And I try to see us as the Beatles, but I can't. You know, like when it's in the midst of all this and people are saying Beatles this and Beatles that, you know, then I've got to accept the thing that they think I'm a Beatle. I'm willing to go along with it. You know, if they want me to be a Beatle, then I will be one.
Jealousy doesn't exist. When John wanted to do a film on his own, we were all happy for him. Now that he's done it, he has passed on to us information about all sorts of things he has learned. That is, as Beatles, we become richer in experience. And George went to India and told us what he had learned. I wrote film music and found out other things which I've passed on.
I said, what is it? I feel ill. I thought I felt ill and I thought I was going cracked. Then it dawned on me that I must have taken some action.
Many of our tracks nowadays have big backings. We couldn't produce the sound on stage without an orchestra. And if we were to do ourselves justice on stage now, we'd have to have at least 3 months to produce a brand new act. And it would probably be very unlike what you'd expect from the Beatles. We feel that only through recordings do people listen to us, so that is the most important form of communication. We have never thought of ourselves as one sound. Merseybeat wasn't our invention. We have always changed our style as we went along, and we've never been frightened to develop and change.